perhaps review some of the issues. Maybe just in addition to what my friend Justus Gillespie said, I was born in Austria, more or less in the middle between two capitals. One was in the west and the other was behind the Iron Curtain in the east, between Vienna and Bratislava. So this kind of division of Europe from my early years on was very visible, because a very usual train connection between Vienna and Bratislava, where people went from one place to another to the Louvre to go to the opera or have some coffee in times of the monarchy, and afterwards was interrupted. So I noticed what is the split, the division line between the West and East meant, and this was always let's say, some sort of a political motivation, and finally political motivation to go into European politics. And since '96, the year 1996, I'm in the European Parliament, and I became immediately vice president of our group for foreign affairs. And in the winter '96-'97, I visited the first time Lithuania and all the three Baltic countries, and it was one of my strong intention in all my political life in the European Parliament to fight for enlargement, for the inclusion of the former parts of the Soviet Empire, independent countries, well, what it was independent at that time, or not independent countries like the Baltic countries, into the European Union. For me, Europe always was not only the West and part of the Central, but it was all Europe. And I think we should not forget, this was a political fight. Going back to the roots of the European Union, sometimes we have to go back to the roots to understand what it is about. And when you said to me and said, here there are much debate about the purpose of the European Union, it's not only Lithuania. In nearly all the countries, there are many people disappointed, they don't see the direction Europe is going. And some of them are disappointed, would say, rightly so, because European Union politics today is very often politics of failure. But let me go back to the reason why Europe, in the sense of the European Union, is existing. It was after the Second World War that politicians, especially from France and Germany, said, we don't want this kind of wars again. We don't want this kind of racism, of xenophobia, of excluding one part of the population, or fighting against each other. We don't want that again. And they came together and founded the basic of the future European Union, supported by people at that time who were not in the European Union, like Winston Churchill, or supported by the Americans, who also were fed up to come a second time into Europe to fight a war on the side of the, let's say, the people who wanted to have freedom. And this was the basic reason why this European Union was built. So the European Union is and was built like as an economic union, but it was not as such an economic union because it was politically motivated, and it was the instrument. And at that time, the European Union was founded, or the European institutions were founded in the sense of, let's put together all these economic instruments which could be used to have wars again, like steel, iron and coal, the basic resources which were supporting armaments inside Europe. And you know that this was also the big fight before the Second World War, when Hitler Germany started to rearm the country in spite of the promises given to the Western powers before. So I think we should never forget that Europe is not just in the core an economic union as a purpose, it was the instrument. And therefore, if people now say, okay, the cohesion fund, the many other important elements, this is Europe and that's it is wrong, because this was not the purpose of creating Europe. And when we fight against xenophobia, we will fight against demolition of democratic values, as we can see in some countries, or violation of democratic values, as Europe. It is because this was the reason to build Europe, to promote democracy, to promote freedom. And therefore, I was also fighting for the inclusion of these countries of the former Soviet Empire, because this is the purpose of European unification, to give people a choice, to give people freedom, to give people democracy and the possibility to live in democracy. And therefore we have to defend it. In Europe, but also outside Europe, because we live, we take it for granted that we have democratic systems, which is not so for granted, because you can have different estimations, but we see in some countries some developments which are going away from democratic developments, and therefore we have to fight together, European Commission, the Council, and the European Parliament, for democracy all the time. But not only inside the European Union, but also beyond the European Union, as far as we can. Not with weapons primarily, but with conviction, by matter of trade, by matter of development. It is not an easy fight, but I think it is up to us also to express these democratic values as universal values. And one of the examples, of course, is the relationship to a country which is close to you geographically, which makes perhaps also some political divisions, like Russia. I was a rapporteur of the European Parliament for Russia, and I have to present in the coming weeks a report on Russia, especially on the negotiations of a new treaty between the European Union and Russia. And also here, I think we have to find a way where we make it clear that we, on the one hand, we want to have a strong cooperation with Russia, in the sense of economic cooperation, we want to have a contribution to the modernization of Russia, modernization not only in the technical sense, but also in the political sense. But on the other hand, of course, developments like we saw, Pussy Riot case, which you probably know from the media, sending them into prison for doing what they did in protest against Putin. We have a colleague of us in the party of Just Russia who is targeted now by the majority to send, sorry, that should not happen, but to send them out of the parliament, of the Duma, because he is too critical about Mr. Putin. These are things we have to, of course, to mention, to argue, to bring it on the table in our discussions with Russia. But at the same time, Russia is an important country, and we have, of course, to try to have our positive influence in the democratic development. I've just brought this example because there are many other examples. You know that we have negotiations with Turkey, where also we have this difficult position of trying to strengthen our ties with Turkey, on the other hand, of course, promoting democratic development in that country. Let me go back now to the situation of the European Union. Yes, we are in a very critical situation, especially economically. Economically, because we're trying to create a common currency, the euro, but we did not create the common institutions and the common policies which are necessary if you have a common currency. If you have Lithuania, or if you have the United States of America, you know, sure, two different countries, different size. If you have one currency, like you have, or the dollar like in the US, you need one strong economic policy. Not everything has to be equal in all the regions, but basic economic policy. The euro area has not that common policy and a common institution. And this is the big mistake, and has been the mistake at the founding of the Eurozone. May I add, the euro is the European currency. There are only two countries who are exempt, have an exemption not to have the euro. This is Denmark and Great Britain. All the other countries, as such, are more or less forced to have the euro if the conditions, the criteria are met. So the euro is not only the currency of some countries who choose, but the euro is the European currency and must be extended step into the other countries. Now, at the moment it's not very popular, I agree, but to make it clear, it's not the currency of some countries, it's the European currency. And therefore, the ECB is the European Central Bank, also with responsibility for all the countries who are in Europe, but again, it's a European Central Bank, and not only for the euro currency. If we have a situation, then we have, as I said, at least if you don't have enough common economic policy, you have at least to have some elements of this policy. What happened? The euro was introduced, and in some of the countries who were joining the euro, but were economically weaker countries, the euro also had the effect of reducing the interest rate. Money in the center of Europe got very cheap. In Greece, in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, in Ireland. And then, what happened with the money? In Greece, unfortunately, part of the public sector was exploding, was building up. In Spain, most of the cheap money went into the property area, the real estate sector. But you know, the real estate sector, the property you have, the houses and the area is limited. You cannot extend it. And the more money you put in, the higher the prices will be. And the prices were very high. And a bubble was created, a bubble like in the United States. And when the bubble exploded, the people couldn't pay back the credit they took from the banks. And the banks were in need. And then the nation, the government came in and gave a lot of money to the banks. And all of a sudden, the country, like Spain, who had a surplus, a budgetary surplus, came into a budgetary deficit with all the problems we have also in the banking sector. Similar things happened in Ireland, and a mixture of that happened in Portugal. This is the real reason. The reason is not, as often told, yeah, you're overspending. People spend a lot of money, and the public sector was going into deficit. The public sector was going into deficit only after people couldn't pay back the money they took from the banks to buy real estate, to buy houses. But then when the bubble broke down and the house prices collapsed, they couldn't get the money to pay back the banks, and that was the reason of the economic crisis we had. The economic crisis must be taken, and this is our criticism for my political group, but not only for my political group, for our political group. The crisis must be used now to build up a new European structure which is able to deal with a common currency. Because if you have a common currency, but the situation like in Germany, also in my country, Austria, is going apart from the situation in Greece, especially in Italy, then we have new divisions. And what is especially negative, what I feel especially negative, we have now in the heads of the people, promoted very often by media, you have that kind of split. You know, the good north and the bad south, the lazy south, you know, the people in the north are working well. You have new splits on the migration issue, which is also in some connection that you say, all these difficulties we have because of migration. Other people say, all the difficulties we have because of enlargement. If we wouldn't have enlarged the European Union, we wouldn't have a problem, we wouldn't have to spend so much money on budgetary support for countries like Lithuania or other countries. Contrary to the spirit and the idea of the European Union to build a new European entity, a new European, not a super state as many people say, but a common Europe. And therefore we have now to, what we have to do now? First of all, as I said, it is a political question.
if we want to have Europe together and the people together living and not splitting again and not going back into nationalism, into xenophobia, we have to have a political support of the basic idea to build Europe. Secondly, yes, we have to have economic restructuring. Economic restructuring means that we have to go away from the over-domination of the financial market to the real market. Because all what happened, what I told, what I said about Spain and others, was because the financial market was over-dominating. Instead of the money going into the real sector to produce product you can export, it was going into banks, it was going the banks which convinced citizens to take many of the credits and buy houses and other things. And you know what happened with speculation in New York, what happened all the time with British banks, for example, with Barclays Bank and others. This over-dominance of financial market is a catastrophe. And you know perfectly well, and you know about the universities here, the best people educated in the sense of education and modern training, in the former years they went into the banking system because this was the future. The banks, to be their bank manager with all the bonus and all the gratification you get. But it was an absolutely wrong overemphasis is on the financial sector, and we have to come back to the real sector where things are produced which you can sell and export. And that's also the reason why the European Parliament, coming from our initiative, but we have a strong majority for financial transaction tax. Financial transaction tax which would take a small amount, only a small percentage of the money turned around in the financial sector going into the real sector to support investments, because we need more investment to create jobs. You have an unemployment rate here in the country which is much too high. You have an unemployment rate of young people which is much too high, and we have countries which have a bigger one. This is not natural. In my country, in Austria, we have the lowest unemployment rate. It's about 4.5%. We have, together with Germany, the lowest unemployment rate for young people. It is possible. It is possible to lower unemployment rate if you go for investment, if you go in the normal production, if you try to control the financial market, and that is what we have in Europe to do. There are many other issues which are in the shadow of economic crisis. As I said on foreign policy, we have to have a strong foreign policy, especially if you think about our common neighbors in the East and in the South, where we need stability, to create stability in the Ukraine, to create stability in the Arab countries, where there is a new development. It is our task, it's our neighborhood. They are some miles away from our borders, and they can influence our fate. So we cannot say, okay, it's Europe alone. No, it's not Europe alone. It's Europe with our neighbors, which we have to do. The environmental question. We have to convince and to argue with countries like China, India, Brazil, that environmental questions are important. The CO2 emissions, which are very dangerous for our environment, we produce 13%. If we do something, we can reduce it from 35 to 12 or 10% of the world's emissions. But if we cannot convince China and other countries also to reduce their emissions, we do a lot of work in our countries, but to change the global environment will not change. So therefore, we need a strong Europe. That's the reason. We cannot be alone. I always say if we are in an international conference and somebody from my country, which has 8 million inhabitants, raises the hand and says, sorry, I want a totally different strategy, you have to change, then the Chinese representative would say, okay, you come from where? From Austria. And how many people do you have? 8 million, that's good. But we have 10 cities who have more than 8 million inhabitants, so what do you talk about? So this is the reality. If we stand up as a common Europe and demand something, goes also with our economic power, then perhaps we can get something. Therefore we have to convince our citizens, our politicians to go really for a united Europe, and that is absolutely important. And there are many other issues I could deal with, and of course from the Social Democrat, I'm especially also on the social issues interested, and I think, and this will be my last remark, these austerity measures are not really bringing us out of the crisis. If you look at the measures in all the countries with a strong austerity, at the end of the day, not at the end of the day, immediately afterwards, the deficit is even higher. Look at what happens in Italy, what happens in Spain. Extreme austerity, cutting of wages, cutting of salaries. And what's the result? The growth is going down, and the deficit is growing. Because if growth goes down, the deficit will grow more or less automatically. So the purpose of reducing the public deficit was not reached by the measures done. Therefore, it is our point of view that we have to go for more investment, that we have to have a financial transaction tax, that we have to fight against tax evasion and tax havens. This is my last number. Every year in Europe, 1,000 billion of euros, 1,000 billion of euro is going away from the fiscal authorities because people put their money secretly, illegally most of the time, into tax havens, into other countries where the taxes are lower in order to evade and avoid taxes. And I think this is not just and this is not fair. So it was a brief sketch of what I think we can do and we should do in Europe. With the European Parliament, we have let's say, a pro-European majority of the People's Party, our party, the second largest group, the Greens and the Liberals. We have many differences in detail, but we try to fight for this common Europe, and we fight also for more participation of citizens in this common Europe. We can perhaps talk if you're interested in that, because also what we see is this kind of making holes in democracy. Because only the European Council can take decisions, the seat of government. Europe must be Europe of the citizens. If I saw here the slogan "Citizens First," not just only for one country, it's for Europe. And we forget about the citizen. If we only speak in technocratic terms, if we only speak about the economic issues, as I said before, it's also about our common values. And one of our common values is democracy. So also this is a subject where we have to fight, because otherwise it's just a technocratic enterprise where we have not have the support of our citizens. In that sense, I want to stop now, and if you have questions or comments, I would appreciate if you could have a small discussion. Thank you very much.